We're on, so welcome everyone to our Hindsight Up Front series on Ukraine. I'm Wilson Center President Mark Green. Our first episode in this series was a conversation with Bob Zoellick. Among other things, Bob was lead negotiator for the 1990 2+4 talks on German reunification. Since he was quite literally in the room at the time, Bob was able to dismantle Putin's false assertion that Western powers had somehow promised that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. Today's discussion drills down on what's happening in Ukraine right now and how the U.S. government, particularly Congress, is working to help Ukraine withstand Russian aggression. Our guests are Senators Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire and Roger Wicker of Mississippi. Now, Senator Wicker is the second highest ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, co-chair of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, and co-chair of the OSCE's Parliamentary Assembly. He's also an Air Force veteran. Senator Shaheen is on the committees both of Armed Services and Foreign Relations, and she chairs the subcommittee on European and regional security cooperation. She has been a vocal advocate for the role of NATO and a vocal critic of Russia's incursions into Ukraine and Georgia. And for all of her good work and efforts, she has been officially sanctioned by the Kremlin and denied a visa to Russia. And as the late Senator McCain would say, there goes spring break in Siberia. On a serious note, both senators are co-authors of the Ukraine Democracy Lend-Lease Act, which would help expedite delivery of military equipment to protect vulnerable civilian populations against Russian aggression. And both recently visited Ukraine, meeting with President Zelensky and ministers of energy, foreign affairs, and defense. I'll begin by turning it to you, Senator Shaheen, for a few words.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for your past service as head of USAID. And I appreciate being here with my colleague, Senator Wicker from Mississippi, and with all of the folks who are watching the Wilson Center's program. We, as Ambassador Green pointed out, Senator Wicker and I, with a bipartisan delegation of 7 senators, visited Ukraine about 10 days ago. We wanted to send a very strong, unified message that there is bipartisan support for Ukraine and bipartisan opposition to what Vladimir Putin is looking at doing, amassing his troops on the Ukrainian border on 3 sides of the country and talking about invading. And what's particularly ironic is that while he's complaining about the threat to Russia from NATO and from Ukraine and from the West, the fact is it's his actions that are uniting NATO in ways that it hasn't been united in a very long time. And the real threat is coming from Russia. So I look forward to this discussion, and we will continue to try and do everything we can in Congress to also provide deterrence to what Putin is doing. There are a number of pieces of legislation that I think help to do that.
Thank you. Senator Wicker, a few words.
Senator Shaheen is an experienced senator who is used to the filibuster, and she managed to do, as she said she would do, give brief remarks. Let me see how brief I can be. I attended earlier this morning a bipartisan, bicameral hearing with the Polish foreign minister, and it hearkened me back to the days when I was an ROTC student and when I was about to enter the Air Force where I served. I never thought Poland would be free. I was pessimistic about that. And yet today we were hearing from the Polish foreign minister about their upcoming chairmanship of the chairmanship in office of the OSCE, and it just it struck me about how far we've come. You know, I'm a fan of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and there were all sorts of deaths and imprisonments and executions to prove that. The evil empire broke up, and Poland is free. When they have an election, you don't know who's going to win till the votes are counted, unlike Russia. Ukraine came along a little later, but they want to be in charge of their destiny. And our international rules-based system of agreements ratifies that. If Ukraine wants to look westward rather than back toward what used to be the USSR, that's the right of the Ukrainian people to do that under an agreed upon international rule-based regime. And they've decided they want to be free market. They've decided they want to have free elections and make their own choices. They have every right to do that. And I was not aware that Mr. Zellick had made such a presentation, but thank you for doing that, Ambassador. I very much appreciate that. If you're interested in a free Poland, then you're interested in what happens between Russia and Ukraine today. If you're interested in a free Pacific and a Taiwan that gets to make their own decisions and have their own elections and chart their own course, then you're interested in what happens this month in Ukraine. If you are interested in preventing a humanitarian disaster, a massive refugee crisis, not only in Eastern Europe, but that spills over into Western Europe, then you're interested in what happens and in the ability of the Ukrainian people and their freely elected leadership to defend themselves. So we're talking about something that goes way beyond Kiev and affects us right here in our cozy little capitals in Washington, D.C. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Senator. Senator Shaheen, this is not your first trip, or wasn't your first trip to Ukraine. You were there just over 6 months ago. How have things changed in that time? How are things different in this most recent visit in January?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the President Zelensky and the leadership of Ukraine is much more focused on the Russian threat. And that has increased as the intelligence has become clearer. And I think the United States has done a good job of sharing that intelligence with the Ukrainian leadership, as well as leadership throughout Europe. One of the biggest deterrents we can provide to what Russia is thinking about in Ukraine is to present a united front. The United States and NATO, the United States and our European allies, because the potential impact of sanctions, if we stand together on Russia, is about 10 times greater than if it's just the United States. So I think there's been a huge diplomatic initiative underway to try and make sure everybody has the same information about what Russia's planning. And we can see, if you're watching the news at night, you're seeing the buildup of Russian troops on 3 sides of Ukraine, not just the eastern border of Ukraine, but also the northern border in Belarus. And Senator Wicker and I co-chair the Belarus caucus, Free Belarus caucus.
Free Belarus. Free Belarus.
Yes, Free Belarus, because one huge concern is that Russia is going to advance into Ukraine from 3 sides of the country. So the defenses in Ukraine are working very hard. I think they're focused. This is a very different Ukraine than Russia invaded in 2014 when they took Crimea. They've been at war for 8 years in the eastern part of the country. They've lost 14,000 Ukrainians in that war, which is a huge number. They've fought very bravely. And one of the things that they said to us when we were there is that they intend to defend their country. They understand that Russia has more troops, a greater military capability, but this is a country now that no longer, as Roger said, looks east, it's looking west. They want to be able to determine their own future, and as a sovereign country, if they want to be part of Europe, then under this rules-based order, they should be able to do that.
Mark, there's not a sense of panic among the leadership over there, and I think sometimes that's misinterpreted in our media. Our leadership in the West is actually more open about predicting that this actually will be an invasion. President Zelensky doesn't want to do that. I think it's more of a sense of not wanting to cause panic, and there isn't panic either among the leadership or any of the indications we saw during the short time we have. I would say there's a sense of resolve. If Mr. Putin invades, which he may very well do this month, he'll have a good day or two of it. He might have a very good first week. He has overwhelming military support, and the Ukrainians haven't asked us for troops at all. But there will be an insurgency for months and years and decades to come if Vladimir Putin makes this mistake. And Russian kids will go home in body bags, and their moms and dads are going to see that. I think it will turn out to be one of the worst mistakes that Mr. Putin could possibly make. But how it turns out a week from now or at the end of February is far different from the sort of insurgency that the Russian invaders are going to see for years and years to come. These people remember how it used to be not to be free, and they never intend to have that again.
You were talking a bit about how things have changed, Senator Shaheen, since you were there last, but also just in the last number of days. So this is a rapidly evolving, rapidly changing landscape. You know, we've read as we're meeting, we read this morning that President Biden is sending 3,000 troops to Europe, not to Ukraine, but to our key NATO allies at their request, as well as putting 8,000 troops on heightened alert recently. So in terms of the U.S. role, we are moving and it is evolving rapidly. Is it enough, Senator Shaheen?
Well, only Vladimir Putin can decide that. He's been given a number of off-ramps to decide diplomacy rather than invasion. And it's not clear who he listens to and what he's going to decide. You know, I was on a call yesterday with the ambassadors from the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as the deputy DCM from Poland. And one of the things that they are all very concerned about is what if Russia goes into Ukraine, who's going to be next? And they're very pleased. They commented on how pleased they were that we were going to be sending additional troops in. They also talked about the unified message from NATO. Again, it's just ironic that Putin talks about Ukraine as a situation where the provocation is going to come from Ukraine and the West, and it's actually Putin who's providing that provocation. And his intent to divide the United States and our allies, to divide NATO, is having just the opposite effect, because it's unifying NATO in ways that the organization hasn't been in many decades.
And if I can,
Mark, she's exactly right. The headline in the Washington Post today says the United States is predicting that Russia will plot to a staged attack as a pretext for Ukrainian invasion. I think that's exactly what people expect him to do. It's what he did in Georgia in 2008 when he invented a pretext and accused this new Democratic Republic of Georgia of causing them to have to move in and invade. It's the very same language he uses, whether it's in the late 1930s, or whether it's Vladimir Putin, who's of the same stripe, here in 2022. He's the neighborhood bully who's always got an excuse. And whatever we do, this time the neighborhood bully has got to get a bloody nose. Nobody's ever given Vladimir Putin a bloody nose. He will regret this in so many ways. And I certainly hope the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is shut down for many, many years when this happens. I hope the banking system and the system that's propped up his multi-billionaire buddies will be sanctioned, and I hope even yet he'll think this through, and perhaps we can avoid this.
So the two of you have emphasized the important element of being bipartisan here in our approach towards Ukraine. You're both co-authors of the Lend-Lease provision legislation. What do you think that will do in terms of helping Ukraine in its readiness? Senator Shaheen?
Well, part of that bill is to make sure that Ukraine doesn't want for supplies, weapons, equipment, whatever they need, because they might not have the funding to cover it at the time. It's based on what we did back during the Battle of Britain before World War II, when we were looking to support England in the fight against Germany. And I think it's important to point out that we expect to see a bill out of the Foreign Relations Committee that's being negotiated by the chair and ranking member that will address many of the issues that we heard from the Ukrainians that they're concerned about: sanctions, weapons and support, looking at what we can do to address some of the most urgent needs that Russia's going to have if they do invade. So things like export controls to try and shut down Russia's manufacturing industry in ways that will prevent them from operating continued invasion. And again, as Roger said, one of the questions that Vladimir Putin has to ask himself is, do I want to do this? I may be successful in week one, but then I'm going to own a country that is the second largest in Europe, that does not want Russia in the country, and is prepared to undergo and is actually training for civil defense and for operations against an invader like Russia. So unfortunately, he doesn't seem to be listening to people, but hopefully he's asking himself that question, because there is still time to deter this battle.
Senator Wicker, it sounds as though we're closing in on the sanctions bill. Do you think we're going to get there?
I think so. There's a possibility it might be put on a spending bill. One strong signal we could have sent was immediate sanctioning of Nord Stream 2. 55 Republicans and Democrats voted for that. We didn't get the 60 votes that are needed for consensus there. That's one thing we could have done that we may learn to regret. Another thing we could do is pass the defense appropriation bill as part of an omnibus bill as soon as possible. And if someone from the administration is within the sound of my voice right now, I would call on the president to get the leadership of the House and Senate in his office today and say, let's iron out our differences. Clearly, we're going to have to, there's going to have to be give and take on both sides. Democrats usually want to plus up domestic spending, but I think everybody agrees that working off of defense appropriations from a year and a half ago are completely inadequate and send exactly the wrong signal, not only to Vladimir Putin and people like him, but to our friends and potential adversaries all over the world. I would hope what is about to happen would build a fire under us. Let's get our national defense spending up to date, and let's heighten that. Jeanne, let's heighten that as an issue. Bob Menendez
Absolutely.
And Jack Reed. Jack Reed has been speaking every day on the floor of the
Right.
Senate about that, and the alarm bells still don't seem to be going off. I can't think of a better signal than getting our defense plussed up.
You're absolutely right. You can bet that this is something that our allies are looking at. They want to know, can we get a budget for the United States? And our adversaries are sure looking at it. And Putin's thinking, boy, they can't even pass a budget. They're never going to be able to unite against our actions. And China is looking at that as well. So this is really critical for us to get done. And as you say, I had a chance to have breakfast yesterday morning with a bipartisan group and the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And
Right.
we asked him that question: what's the impact going to be if we don't have a budget and you have to work off of a continuing resolution? And he was very concerned about what the impact was going to be.
Well, let's hope we get there. I'm going to ask you now a more difficult question. We have the throes of white smoke when it comes to sanctions and to defense appropriations. But I think the tough question is, given what both of you have laid out, that we've already seen an invasion of Crimea, we've already seen an invasion in Georgia, and of course there's Moldova and the amassing of troops. So what does success look like? How do we know if what we're putting together is successful? Senator Shaheen, what does success look like?
Well, success would be Putin deciding that the costs of invading Ukraine are too high for Russia, and he's not going to do it. Obviously, the buildup has continued despite the diplomatic efforts, despite the unifying message coming out of NATO and the stance of our allies. But it's important for us to continue to make as clear as possible what the costs are going to be for Putin, for his oligarch friends, for the economy of Russia, and ultimately for the people. And I remember when Russia went in and seized Crimea and went into eastern part of Ukraine. And there were a number of news reports that Putin was trying to suppress the stories coming out about the Russian troops who were going home in body bags because there was discontent in Russia about what was happening there. And if he continues with this effort, he's going to see that again. And there's going to be concern among the Russian people. And while it's not a democracy, this is a dictatorship, he still has to pay some attention to what the people of his country want. So I think the effort needs to continue. Hopefully we're going to be able to get the budget moving in Congress. Hopefully we're going to get the sanctions package done in a way that will show we're acting together against Russia and in support of the efforts of the United States and the transatlantic alliance. And he will ultimately decide not to invade. But if he does, we better make sure he pays the costs of that, because this is a dictator who doesn't understand anything except power. And as Roger, as you say, he needs a bloody nose if he's going to continue to bully the countries of Eastern Europe, because if he's successful in Ukraine, who knows where he's going to stop.
Maybe Mr.
Senator
Putin
Wicker,
needs
what
to
does
go back.
success look like?
Maybe he needs to go back and watch Charlie Wilson's War. In the end, after a dismal invasion, which they couldn't stop, the people of Afghanistan were armed and finally ran the Russians off. Immediate success would be a miracle, and that would be against the prediction of all the pundits and people who are looking at this inside and outside the administration. For someone in that country to be able to speak truth to power. I worry that there's no one that Vladimir Putin is willing to listen to, that there's no one willing to give him a contrary scenario of what a disaster this might be for him. That's one of the great things about the United States. I mean, I can tell Joe Biden that he's absolutely wrong, and that he's about to make a monumental mistake, and I don't have to go to jail that night, or I don't have to risk being poisoned. I don't know that anybody listens to him, but if someone on the inside could say, Vladimir, I'm your friend, and you're about to go down in history as making one of the worst mistakes ever in the history of Russia, that would be success. Otherwise, success is going to be long-term. In the end, democratic, freely elected countries don't invade their neighbors. Dictatorships with strong men invade their neighbors, and that's the reason we have an international rule of law.
Senator Shaheen, any final words?
Well, hopefully we can continue these deterrence measures, the diplomacy, and ultimately Putin does not invade, because it would be difficult, disaster in Ukraine, I think long-term a disaster for Russia, and it would have impacts throughout the world. So it's very important for us to continue to do everything we can to try and deter him from making that very bad mistake.
Thanks to both of you for sharing your time with us. I know it's a busy day. To those who are watching, in order to access other Hindsight Upfront programs, as well as more of our scholarship and analysis on Ukraine, Russia, and the region, please go to www.wilsoncenter.org/HindsightUkraine. The Wilson Center was chartered by Congress some 5 decades ago. Our work is objective, independent, and fiercely nonpartisan. Thanks to the 2 senators, and thanks to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Thanks.